Sophia's hands stopped moving the moment she heard the word betrayal spoken in Russian across the crowded dining room. Not because it surprised her, because she understood every syllable, and the man they were planning to destroy was standing 15 feet away, completely unaware that the people smiling at his face were already planning to bury him. She had spent 6 years pretending she couldn't understand a single word of Russian. That pretense ended tonight. If you're new to this channel, subscribe now and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Sophia Bennett had a rule she never broke. Keep your head down, do your work, go home, repeat. It was not a glamorous philosophy. It was not the kind of advice you'd find printed on a motivational poster or spoken at a graduation ceremony. But it had kept her alive for 6 years in a city that chewed through quiet people without even noticing the taste. Boston in November had a particular kind of cold that didn't just settle into your bones. It reached deeper than that. It found the spaces between things, the gap between your coat and your collar, the silence between conversations you weren't supposed to be having. Sophia had learned to inhabit those spaces the same way she'd learned everything else useful in her life, out of pure necessity, with no applause and no witnesses. She had worked at Volkov's for 2 years and 3 months, long enough to know which tables required extra attention. Long enough to know that the private dining room in the back, the one with the frosted glass door, and the custom soundproofing that management pretended was just for acoustics, was not simply a premium seating arrangement for clients who valued discretion. Long enough to know that the men who sat in that room were not entirely what they appeared to be in the daylight. But knowing things and acting on things were 2 entirely different problems, and Sophia had spent most of her adult life choosing the former over the latter. She was arranging fresh bread rolls on a service cart near the east corridor when she heard the door to the private room open. Not fully, just a fraction. Enough for sound to travel. Enough for a voice she had never heard before to carry itself into the hallway with the particular confidence of a man who believed himself to be completely alone. The voice spoke in Russian, not the polished textbook Russian they taught in universities. Not the careful broadcast anchor neutrality of someone trying to sound educated. This was something older, something regional and compressed with the particular rhythm of men who had learned to say dangerous things using ordinary words, who had developed a second language inside their first language. A code that existed not in vocabulary, but in cadence, in emphasis, in the specific way certain syllables landed against each other. Sophia's grandmother had called it the language beneath the language. Her grandmother had also told her many times that the most dangerous thing a woman could possess was the ability to understand that language. She was right. She was almost always right. Sophia did not stop moving. She kept her hands on the service cart. She kept her eyes forward. Every instinct she had developed over years of careful, deliberate invisibility told her to walk away, to pretend she had heard nothing, to maintain the performance of ignorance that had protected her every single day she had lived in this city. But the word she heard was not something she could unknow. Predatelstvo. Betrayal. And then 3 seconds later, a name. Volkov. She kept pushing the cart. She turned the corner. She found an empty stretch of corridor, and she stood there for a moment, with her hands pressed flat against the metal surface of the cart, and she breathed slowly, carefully, the way her grandmother had taught her to breathe when the world was trying to make you panic. In through the nose. Hold for 3 counts. Out through the mouth. Again. The voice behind the frosted glass continued speaking. She could still hear it. Not clearly, but clearly enough. Clearly enough to understand that whatever was being discussed in that room was not a business disagreement or a contract dispute, or even the kind of ordinary disloyalty that powerful men experienced every day in cities like this. This was something structural, something planned, something that had been in motion for long enough that the man speaking about it used the tone of someone describing a thing that was already finished, rather than something still being decided. Sophia stood in that corridor for 47 seconds. She counted. Old habit. Then she made the worst decision she had made in 6 years. She listened. Her grandmother's name was Irina Vasilieva Bennett. She had married an American engineer named Thomas Bennett in 1971, which was the kind of story that required enormous amounts of paperwork and a level of personal courage that most people could not fully appreciate from the comfortable distance of the present. Irina had grown up in a small city in the Ural region of Russia, not a place that appeared in travel guides or featured in the romantic imaginings of people who had never been there. It was cold and practical and built around a specific kind of industry that shaped the people who lived there in ways that never entirely left them, even when those people crossed oceans and built entirely new lives. She had worked as an interpreter, not for tourists or business conventions, for the kind of meetings that took place in rooms without windows, where the outcome of conversations could determine the futures of people who were never present in the room. She had listened to things that were not meant to be understood by anyone outside a very specific circle of power. She had translated those things accurately, precisely, without editorializing, without flinching, without allowing her face to reveal a single thought that hadn't been approved in advance. She had done this for 11 years. And then she had done something that required even more courage than any of it she had walked away. She had married Thomas Bennett. She had come to America. She had built a life that looked from the outside like the simple story of an immigrant woman who had found happiness through ordinary means. But she had brought the language with her, the real language, the one beneath the other one. And because she understood that knowledge kept secret becomes knowledge lost, she had passed it to the only person she trusted to receive it carefully, her granddaughter. Sophia had been 9 years old when the lessons began. She had been 23 when they ended shortly before Irina died of a stroke in a hospital room in Cambridge, with her granddaughter holding one hand and a rosary in the other. What Irina passed to Sophia was not simply fluency. It was interpretation in the deepest possible sense of that word. It was the ability to hear what was actually being said, when what was actually being said was buried inside what appeared to be said. It was an understanding of how power spoke to itself when it believed no one was listening. Sophia had used that knowledge exactly once in her adult life. The result had been the reason she moved to Boston. She did not discuss that time. She did not think about it if she could help it. She had placed it in the same mental category as things that had happened to a different version of herself, a younger, more reckless version, who had not yet understood that intelligence without caution was simply a faster route to destruction. She had been cautious ever since, until tonight. The private dining room at Volkov seated 12 people comfortably. Tonight it held 7. Sophia had seen 3 of them arrive together around 8-15 men in their late 50s or early 60s, wearing suits that cost more than her monthly rent, and carrying the particular physical stillness of people accustomed to being observed without being watched. 2 more had arrived separately 20 minutes apart, with the deliberate timing of people who did not want to be seen arriving together. The 6th man she did not recognize. The 7th was someone she knew only by reputation, and by the way the other staff spoke his name in quieter voices than they used for everything else. Alexei Morozov. She did not know his title or his official function. She knew that he arrived every 4 to 6 weeks, always in the evening. Always when the restaurant was full enough for his presence to be unremarkable. Always for meetings that lasted between 90 minutes and 2 hours, and always left before Damian Volkov arrived. Always. That fact had struck her as odd the first time she noticed it, and it had stayed with her in the way that small, apparently insignificant details sometimes do, not demanding attention, but never quite disappearing either. Tonight, for the first time since she had started working at Volkov's, Alexei Morozov had arrived after Damian Volkov. That was the detail that made her slow her cart near the corridor. That was the detail that made the word predatelstvo when she heard it land with the specific weight of something that had been building for a very long time. She didn't catch everything. The door was not open wide enough for that, and she was not going to walk closer. Not in a building where several of the staff almost certainly reported to people above the management structure. What she caught were fragments. But they were the right fragments. They were the load-bearing pieces. A transfer. Significant. The amount suggested by the phrasing was substantial enough that the man speaking it used the specific numerical emphasis that indicated he was being precise rather than approximate. A timeline. Something that needed to happen before the end of the month, before a particular document was signed. A document connected, she understood from context, to a legal transfer of some kind, property or business ownership, she couldn't be certain which. A secondary actor. Someone inside Damien's immediate structure who was cooperating. Someone whose name she didn't catch because it was spoken in the one moment when a server 3 doors down dropped something metallic on a tile floor. And a consequence. What would happen to Damien Volkov when the transfer was complete and the document was signed, and the secondary actor had done what he had agreed to do? The consequence was described in 3 words quickly, in the specific cadence of men who were past the point of discussing whether something should happen and were only speaking about when and how. Sophia pushed her cart around the corner and kept walking. She did not run. She did not show anything on her face. She delivered the bread rolls to table 11, and she refilled 2 water glasses, and she told a gentleman at table 9 that the sea bass special was excellent tonight. And she did all of this with the same expression she wore every single day at this job, polite, present, and completely unremarkable. Inside every alarm her grandmother had ever installed in her was screaming at full volume. The question was not whether what she had heard was real. The question was what she intended to do about it. The obvious answer, the safe answer, the answer that every survival instinct she possessed was pointing her toward, was nothing. She had spent 6 years building a life on the specific foundation of not inserting herself into things that were not her business. She had a small apartment she liked. She had a job that paid her enough to be comfortable. She had 3 friendships she valued and a neighborhood she had learned to feel at home in. She had exactly the kind of life that could be destroyed completely and irreversibly by inserting herself into the affairs of powerful men. She thought about that. She thought about it very carefully while she completed the rest of her service duties for the evening. She thought about the smart version of the choice, which was invisibility, which was the thing she had chosen every day for 6 years. And then she thought about the word predatelstvo and the 3 words that came after it describing what would happen to Damien Volkov, and something that was not quite conscience, and not quite loyalty, and not quite the memory of her grandmother's voice, but was somehow all 3 of those things, at once, made the smart version of the choice feel like the wrong one. She hated that feeling. She had spent years training herself out of it. It didn't help. At 9:47, after the private dining room had emptied and been reset, and after Alexei Morozov had left the building through the service entrance, which she noted because he had never done that before, Sophia knocked on the door of Damien Volkov's private office. Her heart was performing a very convincing impression of a demolition project. Her face showed nothing. The man who said "come in" from the other side of the door sounded like someone who had said those 2 words roughly 10,000 times and had not once been surprised by whoever appeared on the other side. Damien Volkov was 41 years old. He was built like someone who had spent his 20s doing physical work before spending his 30s doing something that required stillness and observation. Instead, there was muscle under the expensive suit. But it was the kind of muscle that served a different purpose now than it had originally been built for. His hair was dark with early gray beginning at the temples. His eyes, when they settled on her, had the specific quality of eyes that processed information at a different speed than most people's, not faster exactly, but more thoroughly, more completely. He did not look like a man who was afraid of anything. He also did not look like a man who expected his evening to be interrupted by a bread cart attendant. Miss Bennet. His English was unaccented, American-educated, with the faint echo of Russian vowels underneath it, only if you knew to listen for them. He had her name, which meant he paid attention to his staff to a degree that his management style didn't always suggest. "Is there something wrong with the service this evening?" "No," Sophia said. "The service was fine." She closed the door behind her. "I need to tell you something. And I need you to let me finish saying it before you tell me I'm wrong." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not much. Just enough. That's an unusual way to begin a conversation, he said. I know. I'm sorry. I don't... She stopped. She restarted. She had planned what she was going to say. In the corridor in the women's restroom where she had spent 4 minutes reminding herself how to breathe in the walk from table 11 to this door, she had planned the exact words. They were not the words coming out of her mouth right now. Something happened tonight during the private dining service. I overheard something I wasn't supposed to hear, and I'm not willing to pretend I didn't hear it. Damian Volkov leaned back very slightly in his chair. The shift was minimal. She read it anyway. People overhear things at restaurants, he said. It's the nature of... They were speaking Russian, she said. And not conversational Russian. They were speaking in a specific dialect and a specific... There's a way of encoding meaning inside ordinary sentences, a pattern of emphasis and structure that... She stopped again. She was not being clear. She was explaining the mechanism when she should be explaining the result. I understood what they were saying, all of it, and what they were saying was about you. The stillness that settled over Damian Volkov in the next 3 seconds was different from his ordinary stillness. Who, he said, was speaking Russian? The men in the private dining room, the meeting that ran from 8:15 to 9:30. That meeting was not conducted in Russian. The primary conversation wasn't, but there was a separate conversation, a portion of it near the end, while the rest of your guests were still at the table. 3 of the men shifted to Russian. She paused. They didn't think anyone could hear them, and they definitely didn't think anyone could understand them. And you can. Yes. He studied her for a long moment. Not with the expression of a man who was deciding whether to believe her or not, exactly that. With the expression of a man who was determining something more specific, not whether she was lying, but what kind of truth she might be telling. What did they say? He asked. Sophia told him. She told him the word she heard first. She told him the context that followed it. She told him about the transfer and the timeline and the document and the secondary actor whose name she hadn't caught and the 3 words at the end. She told him the name of the man she had identified as the primary speaker. When she said the name, Alexei Morozov, Damian Volkov's expression did not change, but his hands, which had been resting easily on the arms of his chair, moved. Just slightly. Just enough to tell her that the name had landed with force, and that the force was not surprise, but something older and heavier than surprise. You recognized Morozov, he said. He comes to the restaurant regularly. I pay attention. Why do you pay attention? She considered how to answer that. Because I've learned that the things people believe you're not noticing are usually the most important things. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It was evaluative. Miss Bennett, Damian said, and his voice had shifted by a fraction, not warmer, not colder, but more precise. You've worked here for 2 years. 2 years and 3 months. And in 2 years and 3 months, you've been an exemplary employee with no complaints on record and no incidents of any kind. He paused. And now you're sitting in my office telling me that you overheard a private conversation between my business associates, understood the contents of a coded exchange in a dialect I'm not even certain most native Russian speakers would follow, and have come here on a Friday evening to report what you heard. Yes, she said. That requires either enormous bravery or an enormous mistake in judgment, he said. I'm still deciding which. She looked at him directly. She had decided in the restroom that she was going to look at him directly, regardless of how it felt. I'm not sure there's a difference, she said, between the two. Something happened in his expression then that she hadn't expected. Not warmth, she hadn't expected warmth. But something genuine. Something that appeared briefly and then was controlled back into neutrality with the efficiency of long practice. How does a restaurant employee, he said, understand Russian military slang and embedded coded language? I didn't say I did it for free, she said. He tilted his head a fraction of an inch. My grandmother was an interpreter, Sophia said. not a professional interpreter in the ordinary sense. She worked in rooms where the conversations being interpreted had consequences. She understood the language the way engineers understand structures, not just the surface of it, but what it's built on. She taught me. She paused. I've never used it professionally. I came here from elsewhere and I wanted a normal life. I wasn't trying to find situations where this skill was relevant. And yet, Damien said. And yet, she agreed. Another silence. This one felt different from the first. Not evaluative exactly. More like something was being reconsidered. The name of the secondary actor, Damien said. The person inside my organization who they said was cooperating. You said you didn't hear it. There was a noise, something being dropped in the corridor. The name was spoken during that moment. Could you describe the voice, the register, the accent, whether there was any identifying characteristic? Sophia had been thinking about this since the moment she walked away from the corridor. Male. Older than the primary speaker, mid-50s, I'd estimate, based on the vocal quality. He didn't speak more than 4 or 5 words during that exchange, and the words he spoke were in the formal register, not the coded one. Which is interesting. Damien's eyes moved slightly. Why is that interesting? Because someone who is cooperating in the way they were describing someone who is already inside the organization and has agreed to help would have been trusted enough to use the same coded register as the others. The fact that he used the formal register suggests either that he was uncomfortable with the language in that form, which means he's not a native speaker with access to regional dialects, or... She paused. Or that the formality was a deliberate performance. That he was being careful not to reveal too much about how well he actually understood the coded language, which would mean the opposite. Damien Volkov was quiet for 5 full seconds. Where did you say you worked before this restaurant? He asked. A translation firm in New York, she said. I handled document translation, legal and technical materials. What brought you to Boston? The question was conversational. It was not conversational. A change, she said simply. He let it rest. She could tell he had filed it the way he had filed everything else in some internal system that she suspected was considerably more organized than most people's. Miss Bennett, he said. He leaned forward slightly. What you've told me tonight, if it's accurate, involves people I have known for many years. It involves a level of organized deception that would require significant time and planning. It involves at minimum one person within my immediate organization. He paused. I want to be clear about something. If you have invented this, if this is a fabrication for any reason, personal or financial or otherwise, the consequences for you would be serious. I know, she said. And you're still telling me. I'm still telling you. Why? She thought about that. She thought about her grandmother, about the 11 years in rooms with no windows, about the way Irina Bennett had described the feeling of knowing something terrible was happening and saying nothing about it, the way that kind of silence didn't stay neutral, the way it became a weight that grew heavier with the years. Because staying quiet, she said, is not actually the safe choice. It just feels like it is. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. I need you to say the coded phrase back to me, he said. The one they used regarding the timeline, exactly as you heard it. Sophia paused. Then she repeated it. In Russian, in the same cadence with the same pattern of emphasis. The change in Damien Volkov's face was small and controlled. But it was real. That phrase, he said quietly, is not in any published lexicon. It's not something that can be found through research or deduction. He stopped. He started again. Where did you learn that specific phrasing? I didn't learn it, Sophia said. I heard it tonight from the men in your private dining room. But I recognized it. My grandmother, she used it once when she was describing a conversation she had interpreted decades ago. She called it a regional identifier. A way that men from a specific background trained in a specific environment would speak to each other. She said that if you heard that phrase, you were not listening to ordinary businessmen. Damien was very still. No, he said after a moment. You were not. He stood. He moved to the window, not to look out of it, she sensed, but because the act of moving was sometimes necessary when what you were doing was thinking. Morozov, he said half to himself. You're not surprised, Sophia said. Not entirely. He turned to look at her. There was something sharp and assessing in his expression, and she felt it land with physical force the way very direct attention sometimes does. No, he said. Not entirely. How long have you suspected him? He tilted his head. You're asking me a great many questions for someone who came in to deliver information and leave. I'm sorry. You're right. I should go. No. The word was quick, almost involuntary. He reordered himself. No. I want you to understand something. He crossed back toward the desk, but didn't sit. He remained standing, which put them at nearly the same level, which she suspected was intentional. What you've done tonight, coming here telling me this, is not a small thing. Whatever your reasons for doing it, the act itself is significant. And the information itself... He stopped. The information itself has changed something that I was already aware was wrong, but could not yet define. I see, she said. I don't think you entirely do, he said. What you described, the timeline, the document, the nature of the arrangement they were discussing. This is not a simple business dispute. This is something that has been constructed carefully over a long period of time. And the fact that they were comfortable enough to have a portion of this conversation in a restaurant that I own means they believed it was safe, Sophia said. Yes, because they believed no one here could understand what they were saying. Yes? She let that sit for a moment. That was a mistake. For the first time, something appeared in Damien Volkov's expression that wasn't calculation or assessment or controlled professionalism. It was very close to humor, just a trace of it, gone almost before it arrived. Yes, he said. It was. He sat again. He looked at her with the full focus of his attention, which was, she was beginning to understand a very specific experience being looked at by a man who actually saw you, not just the surface of you, not just what you were presenting, but the thing underneath it that you were not entirely sure you wanted looked at. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer me honestly. I've been honest with you, she said. I know. That's why I'm asking. He paused. The reason you left New York, the change you mentioned, was it connected to anything related to what you heard tonight? To the kind of world you're describing having been adjacent to through your grandmother's work? Sophia's hands were in her lap. She kept them still. Not directly, she said, but not entirely disconnected either. His expression did not change, but something in the room shifted. Then there are things about your history, he said slowly, that I should probably know. Maybe, she said, but not tonight. A beat of silence. Not tonight, he agreed. And then, with the tone of someone making a decision that would commit him to something he wasn't entirely certain of yet. I'm going to ask you to come back tomorrow morning, not as a member of the service staff, as someone I need to speak with further. He paused. This is not a request for more information about what you overheard. This is something else. What is it? She asked. I'm not entirely sure yet, he said, which is unusual enough that I'm paying attention to it. Sophia looked at him. She looked at the man that people in this city whispered about with that particular mix of fear and fascination that powerful men tend to generate, the man whose restaurant she had worked in for 2 years and 3 months without ever being in the same room as him alone. The man who had just heard something that should have shaken him and had instead become more still and more precise and more focused with each passing second. All right, she said. Tomorrow morning. She stood. She moved toward the door. Miss Bennett? She stopped. What you said earlier, he said, about staying quiet, about it feeling like safety without being safety. She waited. You're right, he said, about that. She nodded once and walked out. She went directly to the women's restroom and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists because her grandmother had told her once that was the fastest way to make your heartbeat behave itself, And she stood there until her hands stopped shaking, and she thought, "What have you done?" And the answer she got back from somewhere deep and stubborn inside herself was the right thing. She wasn't sure those two statements were compatible. She wasn't sure they weren't. She walked home through the November cold with her coat pulled tight and her mind running in all the directions she had trained it not to run. She thought about the voice in the corridor and the word predatelstvo and the 3 words after it. She thought about Alexei Morozov leaving through the service entrance. She thought about the secondary actor, the voice she had heard briefly, the formal register, the 4 or 5 words, and she turned those words over in her mind, the way her grandmother had taught her to turn words over, looking at them from every possible angle. She thought about Damian Volkov saying "not tonight," with the specific quality of a man who understood that there was a tonight, and there were going to be other nights, and that the relationship between them had just permanently changed in a way that neither of them had chosen and neither of them could undo. She thought about what she had told him about silence and safety, and she thought about whether she actually believed it or whether she had said it because it sounded right, and she had needed it to sound right in that moment. She believed it. That was the problem. She had always believed it. She just hadn't been willing for most of her adult life to act on it. She was acting on it now. Her apartment was small and warm, and exactly as she had left it. She stood in the kitchen and made tea she didn't end up drinking. She sat at her table and thought about her grandmother's hands, small and precise, the hands of a woman who had held enormous things inside a small life and never once dropped them. She thought about what it meant to inherit a skill like this. Not to choose it, to receive it from someone who loved you and understood that the world would need you to have it someday, even if you didn't want to. She thought, "I never used this for power." And then sitting in her kitchen at 11:30 on a November Friday with cold tea in front of her and a decision she couldn't take back already made. Maybe this is the moment it's supposed to be used for something else entirely. She was not naive enough to believe this was going to be simple. She was not naive enough to believe she was going to walk away from whatever came next unchanged. But she was her grandmother's granddaughter. And Irina Vasilova Bennett had not spent 11 years in rooms with no windows, and then crossed an ocean to build a life, and then spent 15 years teaching her granddaughter the language beneath the language so that Sophia could use it to fold napkins and carry bread rolls for the rest of her days. The gift had been waiting. It was waiting for tonight. And tonight, Sophia Bennett had answered. She arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. Not because she had been told to arrive at 9 o'clock. Damian had said morning and left it at that. But 9 o'clock felt like the right time for something like this. Early enough to be taken seriously, late enough not to appear desperate. The restaurant was closed at this hour. The front door was locked. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her breath visible in the cold morning air, her bag over her shoulder, wearing the kind of clothes she would wear to a professional meeting rather than a shift on the floor. Because whatever this was, it was not a shift on the floor. A man she had never seen before opened the door before she had a chance to knock. He was large and quiet, and had the specific stillness of someone trained to observe rather than to speak. And he simply stepped aside and gestured for her to follow him, which she did through the empty dining room and past the kitchen and down a corridor she had not previously accessed into a part of the building that did not feel like a restaurant at all. The room she was taken to was not Damian's office. It was larger, plainer, with a long table and several chairs, and the kind of functional emptiness that suggested it was used for meetings that required concentration rather than comfort. Damian was already there. He had a cup of coffee in front of him and several documents laid out on the table, though he turned them face down when she entered, which she noted without commenting on. "You came," he said. "I said I would. People say a great many things." He gestured to the chair across the table. "Sit down, please." She sat. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the night before, with that specific, concentrated attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at everything he considered important. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. There was nothing performative about his attention. He was not looking at her to make her feel seen. He was looking at her because he was actually seeing her, and those two things were very different. "I had some inquiries made last night," he said. About you. Sophia felt the words land. She kept her expression even. What kind of inquiries? The kind I make when someone walks into my office and delivers information that has significant implications. He paused. I didn't find anything alarming. I also didn't find very much at all, which in my experience is its own kind of information. I live a quiet life, she said. You've lived a very quiet life, he said. Deliberately quiet. The kind of quiet that requires sustained effort. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Your employment history before the translation firm is sparse. Your address history before New York is difficult to trace. You have no social media presence, no public records beyond what's necessary, and your official documentation is entirely clean and entirely minimal. He paused. That's not what a person's history looks like when they've had an ordinary life. That's what a history looks like when someone has worked very hard to make it appear ordinary. Sophia said nothing. I'm not accusing you of anything, Damien said. I'm telling you what I found because I think you deserve to know what I know, and because I believe that honesty at the beginning of something difficult is more useful than honesty later when it's too late to matter. She looked at him. You think this is the beginning of something? I think it already began, he said. Last night. She couldn't argue with that. What do you want to know? She asked. The same thing I asked last night, he said. Why you left New York? She had been thinking about this since she walked home. She had been thinking about how much to say and how to say it, and whether the version of herself that had sat in that kitchen at 11:30 looking at cold tea had been right, that this was the moment for the truth, or whether that version of herself had been romanticizing a situation that required more caution than romance. She had decided somewhere around 2 a.m. that the version of herself who had walked into his office the night before had already committed to a particular direction, and that pulling back from it now would be both dishonest and stupid. There was a man, she said. Not a personal situation, not what you might think. A professional situation, or what I believed was professional at the time. He was a client at the translation firm. He hired me for a specific project, what was presented to me as legal document translation for an international acquisition. I did the work, I translated the materials, and then about 2/3 of the way through the project, I began to understand that what I was translating was not what I had been told it was. Damien was very still. What was it? A structured arrangement for moving assets in a way that would survive legal scrutiny on the surface, while concealing the actual nature of the transfer underneath. She paused. I understood it because of the language. Not just the legal language that anyone with sufficient training could parse, but the specific phrasing used in the parallel Russian documents. The same kind of embedded coding that I described to you last night. The language beneath the language. And the man who hired you, when I went to him and told him what I understood, he was not angry. That was the part that frightened me. He was calm. He explained very politely that I had an extremely valuable skill, and that there were people who would pay a great deal of money for access to it, and that the simplest arrangement for everyone involved would be for me to continue the work I had been doing and not discuss what I had noticed with anyone. The room was very quiet. He threatened you, Damien said. He informed me of my options, Sophia said, which amounted to the same thing. And you left. I left the city inside of 3 days. I took nothing from the project. I took very little from my apartment. I came to Boston because I had no connection to Boston, no friends, no history, no reason for anyone to look for me here. And I got a job at a restaurant because restaurant work doesn't require the kind of documentation trail that other work requires, and because I wanted to be somewhere where my particular skills would be entirely irrelevant. She paused. I was very good at irrelevance for 2 years and 3 months. Damien looked at her for a long time. The man from New York, he said. Do you know who he was connected to? I had suspicions. I didn't investigate them. Investigating them would have required drawing attention to myself that I couldn't afford. What were your suspicions? She met his eyes. That he was connected to the same kind of network that I grew up understanding from the outside through my grandmother's work. The same world, different city, different decade, same architecture. Damien set his coffee down. He stood, moved around the table, not toward her, just alongside it, the way he had moved to the window the previous night. Processing through motion. "The people Morozov was meeting with last night," he said, not quite asking. "I can't confirm any connection to New York," Sophia said. "But the dialect, the specific coding structure, the way the conversation was organized, it comes from the same tradition, the same school of communication, for lack of a better phrase." He turned. "Which means the man who approached you in New York and the people currently planning what you overheard last night may be part of the same broader network." "It's possible," she said. "I'm not telling you it's certain. I'm telling you it's possible. And the fact that you ended up here working in this building was not deliberate," she said immediately. "I need you to understand that. I answered a job posting. I had no idea whose restaurant this was when I applied. I researched the business after I was hired, and by then I had already decided this was the safest, quietest corner of the city I had found, and I didn't want to leave it. Did you know who I was? I knew what people said about you. I knew your reputation the way anyone in this city knows it. I kept my distance, and I did my job, and I tried very hard to be invisible. Until last night." "Until last night," she agreed. He came back to the table. He did not sit down. He stood with both hands on the back of the chair, looking at her across the surface of it. "I'm going to tell you something," he said. "And I want you to understand that I am not in the habit of explaining myself to people, so what I'm about to say is not something I do routinely." She waited. "Alexei Morozov," he said, "has been my associate for 9 years. He came to me through a chain of trusted connections that I spent years building. He has been present at the construction of nearly every significant business development in my organization during that time. He knows more about how this operation functions than almost anyone else within it." He paused. "And for the last 4 months I have had a specific and unresolvable feeling that something was wrong. Not a piece of evidence, not a traceable discrepancy. A feeling. The kind that experienced people learn to take seriously, even when they cannot justify it in a way that would satisfy a board of directors." Sophia said nothing. She was listening with everything she had. "What you told me last night," Damien continued, "was not a surprise in the sense of revealing something I had no category for. It was a surprise in the sense of a thing you suspect and cannot prove suddenly appearing in front of you with a face on it." He paused again. "The phrase you repeated in Russian, the coded phrasing. I need to ask you about that specifically." "All right." "My grandmother," he said, and the word landed differently than she expected, with a specific weight that told her it was not a casual reference. "She was Russian. She grew up in the same regional tradition that you're describing. She taught me things about the language, about the way certain words were used in certain communities that I have never discussed with anyone in this organization. Not because it was secret, but because it was not relevant. Or I believed it was not relevant." He looked at her steadily. "The phrase you repeated. I have not heard that phrase since I was a child." The room felt different suddenly. "Your grandmother," Sophia said carefully, "was a woman who understood a great deal about the world she came from," he said, "and who made choices toward the end of her life that cost her a great deal." He stopped. "I'm telling you this because the phrase you repeated is not something you could have heard recently and remembered. That phrase in that specific construction belongs to a generation that is largely gone. The fact that you heard it last night in this building means that the people in that room were not simply businessmen with connections to Russian organized crime networks. They were people with roots deep enough to carry that language." Sophia felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "My grandmother," she said slowly, "used that phrase exactly once, in a specific context. She was describing a conversation she had interpreted, for she never told me who. She only said it was men who frightened her, and that the phrase was one she had not been able to forget." "When was this?" "I was 17, so roughly 20 years ago. But she said the conversation itself had happened decades before that." Damien's expression had the particular quality of a man doing mathematics in real time, sorting through implications, running consequences forward, locating the specific gravity of a thing he had just been told. We need to be careful about what conclusions we draw from this, he said finally. About connections between what your grandmother heard and what you heard last night. The phrase could have passed through generations through different groups without indicating a direct link. Yes, Sophia said. It could have. But you don't think that's what it indicates? No, she said. I don't. He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a hard truth. I'm going to need your help, he said. And I want to be direct with you about what that means before you agree to anything. Sophia looked at him. Go ahead. I need someone who can listen to conversations. I cannot listen to myself either, because I cannot be present without altering the conversation, or because the content is being deliberately concealed in a language I can understand, but not with the depth of interpretation that you have. I need someone who can tell me not just what is being said, but what is being meant. He paused. That person, if they exist and are willing, would be working in a situation that is not without risk. The people involved in what you heard last night are not people who respond gently to complications. I know that. I need you to actually know it, he said. Not as a general principle, as a specific reality that applies to you personally, starting from the moment you agree. She thought about her apartment, about the small warm room she had built her sense of safety inside for 2 years. She thought about her grandmother's hands. She thought about the word predatelstvo and the 3 words that came after it describing what would happen to the man currently standing across the table from her. I need one thing from you first, she said. Name it. Honesty, the same kind you just offered me, the kind at the beginning, before it's too late for it to matter. If there are things about this situation that affect my safety or my ability to make informed decisions, I need to know them as they develop. Not selectively, not managed, actually. She paused. I'm not asking to be inside your organization. I'm not asking for access to things I don't need. I'm asking to be treated like someone with the intelligence to handle real information because I think you've already figured out that I am. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, but it shifted. That, he said, is a reasonable thing to ask. Do we have an agreement? He extended his hand across the table. We have an agreement. She shook it. His hand was warm, and his grip was firm. And when she met his eyes across the handshake, she had the sudden disorienting sense of something being sealed, not just between 2 people, but between 2 entirely different worlds that had somehow intersected in a cold room in a closed restaurant on a Saturday morning in November. She did not let go of his hand too quickly. That would have been the nervous choice. She let go at the right moment, and she sat back and she said, Tell me everything about Alexei Morozov. And to his credit, he did. Morozov had entered Damian's world through a man named Yuri Petrenko, who had been Damian's first serious business partner and who had died 5 years earlier of a heart attack at a hotel in Prague. Petrenko had vouched for Morozov personally with the specific and unqualified certainty that trusted people use when they believe in what they're saying. Damian had accepted the introduction because Petrenko had never been wrong. In 9 years, Morozov had never done anything that could be identified as a direct betrayal. He had been present, efficient, reliably informed, and strategically useful. He had brought significant business relationships that had proven legitimate. He had managed sensitive situations with the kind of discretion that couldn't be performed. It had to be real, which meant Sophia said that he was either genuinely loyal until very recently, or the commitment to the role had been deep enough to maintain over a very long period without a single visible fracture. Which is more frightening, she said. Yes, Damian agreed. It is. The document, the one she had heard mentioned in connection with the timeline Damian told her, was a legal transfer of a real estate holding company that controlled properties across 6 states. The transfer was scheduled to be completed before the end of the month. On paper, the transaction was straightforward. In practice, if someone with knowledge of the company's internal structure moved against it at precisely the right moment, during the window between the filing and the completion, they could redirect specific assets in a way that would be legally defensible and practically irreversible. And the secondary actor, Sophia said. The person inside your organization. Would need to have access to the filing timeline, Damien said, which narrows it to 4 people. 4. 4 people knew the exact dates: my attorney, my chief financial officer, my head of operations, and Morozov. You said Morozov is the primary external contact, so the secondary actor, if there's someone inside the 4, has been doing something extraordinarily patient, Damien said quietly, for a very long time. Sophia felt the weight of it. You have 4 people. One of them is working with Morozov. Or Morozov is working with all 3, and the conversation you overheard was describing not a single cooperating actor, but a coordinated effort. She thought about the voice she hadn't caught the name of. The formal register. The 4 or 5 words. When I said the secondary actor used the formal language register, is that something that would distinguish your attorney from your operations head? Damien looked at her. Say more. A formal register in the context of that conversation would suggest someone who is either not a native Russian speaker or who is consciously avoiding the coded register because they are not comfortable being identified as someone who understands it. Your attorney, what's his background? American. 3rd generation. His family is from Ohio. Operations. Born in Kyiv. Russian fluent. Then your operations director would not naturally default to the formal register in a Russian conversation. He would use the natural spoken register of someone who grew up with the language. She paused. Your attorney, on the other hand, would use formal Russian because formal Russian is the only Russian available to him without revealing a level of language proficiency that he either doesn't have or doesn't want to disclose. Damien was absolutely still. His name, he said, and his voice had changed in a way she couldn't fully categorize, lower with an edge under it, is Lawrence Holt. He has been my attorney for 11 years. He handled my mother's estate. He has been at every significant legal juncture of my professional life for over a decade. I know that's not what you wanted to hear, she said. No, he said. It is not. And then, after a pause that carried inside it something that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it, it is also the thing I have been trying not to understand for 4 months. The feeling you mentioned, Sophia said quietly, that something was wrong. Lawrence handled the filing for the property transfer, he said. He is the person who set the timeline. He is the person who communicated the specific dates to the other 3 parties. A pause. I brought him a concern last month, a minor discrepancy in one of the subsidiary filings. He resolved it the next day, seamlessly. I thought at the time that it was an example of his competence. He stopped. I understand now that it may have been something else entirely. He was smoothing over a seam in something larger. Yes. Sophia thought about what to say next. She thought about what her grandmother would have said Irina, who had spent 11 years in rooms where the truth was hidden inside the language, who had understood better than anyone that the most dangerous lies were the ones that had been maintained for so long they had stopped feeling like lies to the person telling them. The first thing we need, she said, is not to let Lawrence Holt know that you know. Damien looked at her. The we had landed. She could see it landing. He didn't comment on it. Agreed, he said. Which means your behavior toward him needs to be completely unchanged, and toward Morozov as well. If either of them senses a shift in your approach, they'll accelerate the timeline, yes. Or they'll disappear entirely, and you'll have lost both of them, and whatever they've already set in motion will still be in motion without anyone in the room to stop it. Damien nodded slowly. You've thought about this kind of situation before. My grandmother taught me to think about it, she said. Theoretically, she called it consequence architecture, understanding not just what is happening, but what will happen next if each possible action is taken. She said the most common mistake people make when they discover a deception is to react immediately, which destroys the one advantage they have. The advantage of knowing that the other person doesn't know, you know. Yes, the window. Once you react, the window closes. And everything that needs to happen before the window closes has to happen inside it. Damien leaned forward. What needs to happen inside the window? She thought about it. Evidence. Genuine, documentable evidence of the arrangement between Morozov and Holt. Not the conversation I overheard that's unverifiable and usable only as background. Actual documentation of the mechanism they're using. The transfer pathway. The asset redirect. Something that exists in writing or in a format that can be produced. She paused. And identification of who else is involved. The conversation last night had multiple people in that room. Not all of them were principals. But some of them were. You saw them. I saw them arrive. I can describe them. That's useful, he said. And then with the tone of someone testing a theory, you have an extraordinary amount of structural clarity about a situation you just encountered last night. Sophia met his eyes. My grandmother didn't just teach me the language. She taught me how to survive in proximity to the kinds of people who used it. A beat of quiet. Was she ever afraid? He asked. And the question was so unexpectedly personal that for a moment she simply looked at him, at the man behind the controlled surface, the man who had just told her that his grandmother had also known this world, this language, this tradition of speaking dangerously. Yes, Sophia said. But she had a specific philosophy about fear. She said that fear is information, not instruction, that it tells you something is important, but it does not tell you to stop. He was quiet for a long moment. I'd like to have met her, he said. She would have seen through you immediately, Sophia said. She saw through everyone immediately. She would have done exactly what I'm doing, told you something you needed to hear that you didn't ask for. Something in his expression moved. She was getting better at reading the small changes in it. This one was not quite a smile. It was something that existed in the space where a smile might eventually be if enough things went right. I believe that, he said. They worked for 2 more hours. By the time they finished, they had a rough map of what the next 2 weeks needed to contain. Damien would proceed with the property transfer preparation as though nothing had changed. He would give Lawrence Holt no indication of any shift in his confidence or his plans. He would request through normal channels a series of routine meetings and document reviews that would allow them to understand more precisely where the gaps in the arrangement were. Morozov would receive the same treatment, normal communication, normal access. Nothing that would read as surveillance. Sophia's role was less defined and more complex. She would return to her regular shifts as though nothing had changed. She would pay attention. She would be available through a secure channel Damien would establish by end of day for situations where her specific ability was needed. And she would tell him if at any point she felt the situation was moving faster than their control of it. One more thing, she said as they were finishing. What? The man from New York, the client I told you about. She paused. I don't know whether his network is connected to what you're facing, but I think you should know his name. Not because I know what it implies for your situation, but because you should have all of the pieces I have. Damien looked at her steadily. Tell me. She told him. The change in his face was minimal, but it was real, and it was the first moment in 2 hours during which she saw something in Damien Volkov that was not controlled or calculated or managed, something raw and quick there and then gone like a match struck in a dark room. You're certain, he said. That was the name he gave me. Whether it was his actual name is something I can't confirm. Damien sat back. He looked at the ceiling for one moment, a single second of looking at something other than the immediate problem, and then he looked back at her. Miss Bennett, he said. You can call me Sophia, she said. Given the circumstances. Sophia. He said her name the way someone says a word they are tasting for the first time, carefully, attentively, as if the sound of it contained information. The man you just named is not someone from the periphery of the world you're describing. He is not a secondary player or a regional connection. I know, she said. You understand what that means for the scope of what Morozov and Holt may be part of. Yes. And you're not frightened. She looked at him. I didn't say that. The look he gave her in that moment was different from any look he had given her before. It was not assessment. It was not calculation. It was something much simpler and much more profound than either. It was recognition. "Neither am I," he said. "But I'm not letting it stop me either." "Good," she said. And then, "Neither am I." She picked up her bag. She stood. She looked at the man across the table from her, at the person behind the powerful reputation, at the man who had just told her about his grandmother, and about the feeling of something wrong that he had been carrying for 4 months, without being able to name, at the man who had said her name for the first time with that specific, careful attention. And she thought, this is not simple. It was never going to be simple. But simple had never been what her grandmother built her for. She left the building through the front door, into the November morning, into the city that had been her refuge for 2 years and 3 months, and that was about to become something else entirely. Behind her, she knew Damien Volkov was sitting in an empty room, turning over a name she had just given him, fitting it against 4 months of unresolved feeling. Understanding with the particular clarity of a man who had just seen the full shape of a thing he had been looking at sideways for too long. She did not look back. She didn't need to. Some decisions once made have a direction built into them. She walked toward hers. The first week passed. The way all genuinely dangerous things pass when you are living inside them slowly on the outside at a speed that made her teeth hurt on the inside. Sophia went to work. She carried bread rolls and refilled water glasses and smiled at guests who had no idea what was moving beneath the surface of the restaurant they were dining in. She answered questions about the menu and helped seat tables and performed the quiet, competent invisibility she had spent 2 years perfecting. And every single day, she did this with a secondary layer of attention running underneath it that never fully stopped. She was watching, not obviously. Her grandmother had taught her that the worst kind of watching was the kind that could be felt. You watch with your peripheral vision, Irina had said. You watch with your ears. You watch by being so completely unremarkable that the thing you are watching forgets you are capable of seeing at all. She watched Alexei Morozov arrive on Tuesday evening for a dinner that was not in the private room, but at a regular table near the west wall, which was unusual. He came alone, which was more unusual. He ordered, sparingly drank 1 glass of wine, and spent 40 minutes doing something on his phone that kept his expression carefully neutral in the way that people's expressions become carefully neutral when they are reading or writing something that they are simultaneously trying not to react to. She passed his table 3 times. On the 3rd pass, she caught a single word on his screen before his hand moved to cover it. The word was in Russian. The word was Shrok. Deadline. She delivered the bread to table 12 and kept walking and filed it away in the specific internal cabinet she had been developing all week, organized not by incident but by implication, the way her grandmother had taught her to organize information when you couldn't yet see the full shape of a thing. She texted the secure line Damien had established. A single word, as they had agreed, for low-urgency information: Russian. She followed it with Shrok and the time and Morozov's table number. His response came 4 minutes later. 2 words. Understood. Watching. She put her phone away and went back to work. Damien, for his part, was doing something that cost him considerably more than it appeared to cost him. He was pretending nothing was wrong. He met with Lawrence Holt on Wednesday for the regularly scheduled review of the property transfer documentation. He sat across the conference table from the man who had attended his mother's estate proceedings, who had been present at every critical legal moment of his professional life for 11 years. And he listened to Lawrence's careful, precise explanation of the filing status and the timeline and the remaining requirements, and he asked the questions a man would ask who trusted completely the person presenting the information, and he watched Lawrence's face for the specific quality of strain that exists in someone who is maintaining a significant performance. He saw it. Twice. Both times quickly suppressed while Lawrence Holt was not an amateur at composure. But Damien had spent his adult life in rooms with people who were managing the gap between what they were saying and what they were thinking, and the specific tells were not verbal. They were physical. The half-second of delay before Lawrence answered the question about the filing date. The way his pen moved between his fingers when Damien mentioned the name of the property holding company, not nervously, but with the concentrated stillness of someone deliberately not being nervous. After the meeting, Damien sat in his car for 6 minutes and did nothing but breathe. He had known Lawrence Holt for 11 years. He had trusted Lawrence Holt in the specific and unreserved way that you trust someone who has been present at the worst and most private moments of your professional life. He had recommended Lawrence to 2 other people in his circle, people whose trust was not easily extended, who had taken him on specifically because of Damien's personal endorsement. The scope of the thing that Lawrence had agreed to was not simply a business betrayal. It was a systematic dismantling of a trust that had been built at enormous personal cost over more than a decade. He started the car and drove. He called Sophia from the road because they had agreed that phone contact was acceptable for non-specific exchanges. "How was the meeting?" she asked. She already knew who it was. They had not discussed how she would answer his calls, but she had answered correctly from the first one, which told him she had thought about it in advance, which told him something he was filing in a different internal cabinet from the professional one. "Exactly what we expected," he said, "and exactly as difficult as I expected it to be." A pause on her end. "I'm sorry." He hadn't anticipated her saying that. He didn't know entirely what to do with it. "Srok," he said instead. Last night's text. Morozov was confirming something. A deadline being moved up or confirmed. We need to know which. He paused. "I'm going to arrange a dinner. Private room. A business context that makes sense for Morozov to attend. I want you working the room." "When?" "End of the week, Friday." "I'll be there," she said. He almost said something else. He stopped himself. There was a version of this conversation that existed outside the practical parameters of what they were doing, and he was keeping himself on the right side of that boundary with a degree of effort he was not entirely comfortable acknowledging, even internally. "Thank you," he said instead. "For yesterday. For—" He stopped again. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "We have an agreement." "I know," he said. "I'm thanking you anyway." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Drive carefully." He hung up. He drove. He thought about a woman who had walked into his office on a Friday night and told him the truth, when the truth was the most dangerous thing she could possibly have offered him. And he thought about what that said about her, and he thought about what it meant that the first person in a very long time who had made him feel genuinely seen was someone who had walked into his life carrying a secret that was almost certainly going to make everything more complicated. He had always had a specific talent for complicated. Thursday brought 2 things. The first was a name. Damien's security director, a man named Petrov, who had worked for him for 7 years, and who was one of the 4 people who knew the property transfer timeline, which Damien had not yet reconciled with the clarity it required, delivered a report on the men Sophia had identified arriving at the restaurant the previous Friday. 3 of them were traceable. 2 traced to investment networks in Eastern Europe with what Petrov described as irregular capital flows. The 3rd traced to a law firm in Delaware that existed on paper and very little else. The 4th man, the one she had not been able to fully observe, who had arrived latest and taken the seat nearest the door, was not traceable at all, which meant either that his identity had been deliberately obscured, or that whoever was running the background on these men had hit a boundary they weren't equipped to cross. Petrov handed Damien the report with his usual efficiency and his usual absence of editorializing, and then he said something he had not been asked for. "These men," Petrov said, "their organizational pattern, the way they structured their arrivals, the specific spacing, it's not typical of organized crime in the usual sense. The spacing is trained, military in origin or intelligence adjacent, people who were taught to move in public without forming visible clusters." Damien looked at him. "You're saying they have a background. I'm saying they move like people who were trained by professionals to avoid being identified as a group." A pause. "Which means whoever they are working with has access to a very specific kind of resource." After Petrov left, Damien sat with that for a while, and then he called Sophia. "The men from Friday," he said. "What I'm about to tell you, I need to know whether it changes how you read what you heard." He told her what Petrov had described. The silence on her end was brief, but specific. He was learning her silences. This one was not surprise. This one was the silence of someone encountering confirmation of something they already suspected. It changes the scope, she said. It doesn't change the substance. Another pause. My grandmother described the people she worked for in exactly those terms. Trained movement. Trained silence. Men who had learned to exist in public spaces as individuals rather than a collective. She said it was the single most effective camouflage she had ever seen because it was invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. And you know what to look for, she taught me. A beat. Damien. The first time she had used his name without the formal structure around it. He noticed. He suspected she noticed that he noticed. What she described the organization she was connected to as an interpreter, she never gave me a name for it. She said names were the last layer of information, the most dangerous layer, and that she had learned not to carry names if she could help it. But she described the structure, the way it operated, the way decisions were made and communicated and enforced. And it matches, he said. What you're hearing now. The architecture is the same, she said. The same structure, different decade, different geography, but the same underlying design. He thought about that. He thought about his grandmother, about the things she had said in the last years of her life, that he had understood only partially at the time, and was only now beginning to fully hear. About the specific warning she had given him once, about the kinds of connections that looked like partnerships and functioned like traps. He had thought at the time that she was speaking in generalities. He understood now that she had not been. There's a second thing, he said. From today. The fourth man, the one you couldn't fully identify from Friday. You found him? No. That's the thing. He paused. Petrov hit a wall. Which means the fourth man is either very well protected or very well concealed. In my experience, when you cannot find a person through standard investigation, it's because someone with significant resources has made them difficult to find. Or, Sophia said carefully, because the person doesn't exist in the way we're looking for them. Explain. What if the fourth man isn't an independent actor? What if he's someone who is officially connected to a completely different context? Someone whose presence in that room would only be scandalous if you knew to look for the connection. Someone whose legitimate identity is so clean and so public that running a standard background search would return nothing useful, because the problem isn't who he is, it's what he's doing. Damien was quiet for 3 full seconds. You're describing someone with public legitimacy, he said. Political, legal, institutional. I'm describing the possibility, she said. But it would explain why Petrov hit a wall. Because the wall isn't a gap in the record. The wall is a record so complete and so clean that it doesn't flag. If that's true, Damien said slowly, then this is not a business operation. This is something that has institutional cover. Yes, she said. That's what I think it is. The weight of what that meant settled over the conversation, without either of them naming it directly. Friday, he said finally. We stay on Friday. Yes, she agreed. We stay on Friday. Friday's dinner was arranged as a strategic review. 4 of Damien's senior business contacts invited for an evening that was framed as quarterly relationship maintenance. Morozov was included as a matter of course. Lawrence Holt was not invited, which was deliberate. Damien wanted Morozov without Holt present, wanted to observe whether the absence of his apparent internal contact would change anything about how Morozov conducted himself in a group setting. Sophia worked the room with 2 other members of the floor staff. She was not positioned near the private dining room. She was in the main dining area where the 4 other tables provided sufficient coverage to make her presence completely unremarkable. The private room door was not soundproofed against the ventilation system. This was not an accident. Damien had arranged through Petrov and through a conversation he did not fully explain to Sophia in advance for the evening to include a specific ventilation adjustment that meant certain conversations in the private room were audible, barely at low volume, but audible through a specific grate located near the service corridor. He had told her on Thursday morning that this arrangement would exist. He had told her where to be and at what time to be there. He had told her she would have a 4-minute window. He had also told her that he understood if she was not comfortable with what he was asking. She had told him she was comfortable. She had not told him that comfortable was not exactly the word she would have chosen, but that she had stopped waiting to feel comfortable before doing necessary things somewhere around the age of 23. At 9:18, she excused herself from the floor on the pretext of retrieving a specific bottle from the back storage area, and she walked the corridor, and she stood at the grate for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and she listened to 3 men speak in Russian about a thing that was no longer hypothetical. The transfer was not the endpoint. It was a mechanism. What moved through the transfer, what the asset redirect actually carried, was documentation, not financial documentation. Evidence. Records of a long-term arrangement between a network that Damien's organization had been adjacent to without knowing it, and a series of institutional actors whose names, when spoken in that room, made Sophia's internal temperature drop by approximately 10 degrees. She heard the name of an agency. Federal. American. She heard the name of a sitting official. She heard Alexei Morozov speak for the first time with the coded register fully engaged. Not the careful managed Morozov she had been observing for the past week, but the man underneath the managed performance, the man who knew the language at depth and used it with the ease of someone for whom it was native rather than learned. She heard him say clearly, and without any apparent concern for being overheard, because he had no reason to believe anyone within range could understand him, "The girl is a complication." She heard the response from the man to his left, how much of a complication. She heard Morozov say she went to him. She told him what she heard. We don't know yet how much she understood. A pause. Then find out. Sophia walked back to the floor. She delivered the wine bottle to the correct table. She smiled at a guest who complimented the selection. She refilled a water glass. She moved through the dining room with the absolute granite composure of a woman who had just heard her own situation described in a private meeting and was choosing right now in real time how to respond to that information. Her grandmother's voice inside her head was extremely clear. Fear is information, not instruction. She texted Damien from the service corridor, not the usual single word. 3 sentences. She kept them factual and sequential and stripped of everything except what he needed to know. His response came in 90 seconds. Do not leave the building until I reach you. Stay visible. Keep working. She put her phone away. She kept working. He arrived at the building through the back entrance 22 minutes later. She knew this because Petrov appeared at the edge of the dining room and made eye contact with her for exactly 1 second, which was the signal they had arranged. She finished the table she was attending, excused herself with the practiced smoothness of 2 years of floor work, and went to the back corridor where Damien was waiting. He looked at her with the specific concentrated attention that was different from his usual assessment. There was something in it that went beyond the practical. You're all right, he said. It was not quite a question. I'm all right, she said. It was entirely true, and also only partially true. But this was not the moment for partial truths. Tell me everything. She told him everything. She told him about the transfer being a mechanism for moving documentation. She told him about the name she had heard, the agency, the official. She told him what Morozov had said about her. She said it plainly without softening it, because softening it would have been a disservice to both of them. When she finished, Damien stood very still for a moment. They know about you, he said. They know I went to you. They don't know how much I understood. She paused. But they're going to find out. Morozov is going to ask questions. He'll watch the staff. He'll try to identify which employee could have overheard the conversation and understood it. How long do we have? Before he narrows it down a few days, before he's certain it was me. She thought about it. Less. Damien looked at her with an expression that had something in it she could not immediately name. It was not fear. She had established already that fear was not the primary language of his face. It was something more complicated than fear, something that lived in the region between professional calculation and something more personal, and she watched him work to keep those two things from collapsing into each other. I'm moving you, he said. Tonight. Damien. Not a discussion, he said. And then, because he had apparently heard himself use a tone that didn't belong in their agreement. I'm asking you, but I'm asking you urgently. Whatever you need from your apartment, I'm sending someone with you in the next hour. You cannot stay there once Morozov begins narrowing his search. She thought about her apartment. The small, warm space she had built her safety inside. The particular arrangement of her grandmother's books on the shelf above her desk. The tea she made every morning in the same blue mug. All right, she said. He nodded. The relief that crossed his face was controlled, but real. There are things we need to talk about, she said. What I heard tonight, the names. The agency, the official. This is larger than a property transfer. This is larger than Morozov and Holt. I know. The documentation they're moving, if it gets where they're sending it, it doesn't just damage your organization. It provides cover for everything they've been building. It makes what they've done look like something you sanctioned. She paused. They're not just taking from you. They're constructing a version of your history that they control. His jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. They've been patient, he said quietly. They've been building this for years, she said. Morozov didn't happen last month. This was already in motion when Petrenko introduced him to you. Petrenko may not have known, or he may have been part of it, and his death may not have been the natural event it appeared to be. The quality of Damien's stillness changed. She felt it change. Petrenko, he said. I'm not saying it's certain. I'm saying that the scope of what we're describing, a long-term multi-actor arrangement with institutional cover, does not accommodate coincidence well. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she let the silence stay without filling it, because some things need the space to fully arrive. He was my friend, Damien said finally, very quietly. I know, she said. I'm sorry. They stood in the corridor without speaking for a moment that held more than either of them addressed directly. She was aware of the distance between them, close in the narrow corridor, close enough that she could hear him breathe. She was aware of what was not being said, and of the specific effort they were both making not to say it. We need to move quickly, she said. Before the window closes. Yes. He reordered himself. Back to the practical. Back to the operational. Back to the specific and solvable, rather than the broad and devastating. I need everything you can remember from tonight. Names, phrasing the exact sequence of what was said. Petrov is going to need it. I already started, she said. She pulled out a small notebook, real paper. Her grandmother's preference because digital records have trails and paper only exists where you put it, and handed it to him. I wrote it down in the corridor after I came back from the grate, while it was still exact. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. Your grandmother taught you to carry paper, he said. She said that memory is accurate for 7 minutes after an event and approximate for everything after that. She said that the 7-minute record is the most valuable thing you can make. A pause. She had very specific opinions about documentation. She sounds, he said, like someone I would have trusted completely. Sophia looked at him, at the man who had just told her about Petrenko, with a grief that was not performed at the man who was holding a small notebook filled with the evidence that was going to determine what happened to everything he had built. And she thought, this is the person. Behind the cold, behind the power, behind the years of necessary distance. This is who is actually here. She would have trusted you too, she said. Conditionally. With reservations. But she would have. Something moved in his face. Conditionally, he said. She trusted no one without conditions. She said unconditional trust is a romantic fantasy that gets people killed. She was not wrong. She was almost never wrong. Sophia paused, which made her very difficult to argue with. The trace of that almost smile appeared again. Controlled, brief, real. Come on, he said. We have work to do. The next 48 hours moved at a speed that compressed everything non-essential and left only what mattered. Petrov processed the notebook within hours and cross-referenced the names against every database he had access to. The official Sophia had named was confirmed, not difficult to confirm once you had the name, because the man was public in ways that made his existence easy to verify. But his connection to what Morozov's network was building was not something that appeared in any public record or searchable database. The connection existed in the space between what was documented and what was implied, which was exactly where the most dangerous things always lived. Sophia was installed in a property that Damien controlled through 3 layers of corporate structure. A clean apartment in a different part of the city, carefully unremarkable with nothing attached to her name. She brought almost nothing. Her grandmother's books, the blue mug, a photograph that lived inside a book she had been carrying since she left New York. She did not tell Damien about the photograph. Some things were still private. She worked from the apartment during the day, translating and analyzing documents that Petrov sent through the secure system materials connected to Morozov's business dealings that Damien's team had been accumulating for the last week. Documents that required not standard translation, but the specific interpretive layer that Sophia could provide the reading beneath the reading. What she found in those documents was both worse and better than expected. Worse because the scope of what was being documented confirmed that this arrangement had been in deliberate construction for nearly 8 years. Not 9, not from the beginning of Morozov's association with Damien, but close enough to the beginning that the distinction was almost academic. 8 years of patient, careful, sustained construction of a mechanism that would, when activated, redirect significant assets and simultaneously deposit a documentary record that implicated Damien's organization in arrangements he had never made or sanctioned. Better because the documentation had gaps. Deliberate gaps, she thought, at first, places where the record was thin in a way that might indicate deliberate caution. But the more she looked, the more she understood that the gaps were not deliberate. They were structural. They were the places where the mechanism depended on Lawrence Holt to complete the circuit, and Holt had not yet completed it because the transfer had not yet been finalized. The circuit was still open. She called Damien. "I know what they need Holt to do," she said, "and I know the exact moment they need him to do it. Tell me." She told him. She told him about the gaps, about the structural dependency, about the specific window. Not just the month-end deadline, but a narrower window within it, a 48-hour period when the filing could be submitted in a way that would allow the redirect to function. Outside that window, the mechanism didn't work. The architecture required a specific legal moment, and that moment was in 4 days. If Holt doesn't file during that window, she said, the opportunity closes. The transfer still happens, but the redirect doesn't. The documentation doesn't move. And they need Holt to create the specific filing that enables the redirect. Yes. Without that filing, the mechanism is incomplete. The documentation stays where it is, and the redirect doesn't happen. Damien was quiet for a moment. Then, "So we need Holt not to file. Or to file something different," she said. "Something that completes the transfer legitimately, but doesn't include the component they need." "Can you—" He stopped. "Do you know enough about the mechanism to understand what that component looks like in legal language?" "I know what it looks like in Russian," she said. "I would need your attorney, a different attorney, to translate the structural requirement into what it would appear as in the filing documents." "I have someone," he said immediately. "Someone Holt doesn't know. Someone outside this network entirely." "Then we need to move," she said. 4 days, Damien." "I know." A pause. "Sophia." Her name in his voice with that same specific quality it always had, careful, attentive, as though the sound of it contained something worth not rushing. "I need to ask you something personal." She waited. "The man from New York, the name you gave me. Have you considered that the reason you ended up in this city in that restaurant may not have been as accidental as it felt?" She had considered it. She had considered it at length in the middle of the night, lying in a bed in an apartment that wasn't hers. "I've considered it," she said. And I don't know. I can't know. Either I arrived here by genuine coincidence and the language I carry happened to be useful at exactly the right moment, or I was directed here in a way I can't fully account for." She paused. But I want you to understand something. Regardless of which of those is true, the choice I made on Friday night was mine. Not directed, not planned. Mine. A long pause. I know, he said. I'm not questioning that. You're questioning whether I'm safe, she said. I'm questioning whether either of us is safe, he said. There's a difference. She thought about that. About the word either. About the specific way he had used it, not whether you are safe, but whether either of us. The implication of the pairing. She let it stay without commenting on it directly. 4 days, she said. Let's focus on what we can control. Yes, he said. 4 days. She put the phone down and sat with the documents and the specific knowledge that somewhere in this city, a man named Alexei Morozov was narrowing down a search that was going to end with her name, and that the 48 hours of window she had identified and the 4 days until it opened were going to require everything she had been built to do. She opened her grandmother's notebook, the real one, the one that had been in the bag she carried from her apartment, old and worn and filled with Irina's precise handwriting in 3 languages. She turned to a page she had read so many times the paper was soft at the edges. Irina had written, "The person who sees what others cannot see is not cursed with the burden of knowing. They are entrusted with it. The weight is not punishment. It is purpose." Sophia sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. 4 days felt like 4 hours and 4 years simultaneously. Sophia had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours since moving into the apartment Damien controlled, and she had stopped noticing the absence of sleep, the way you stop noticing a sound that has been running long enough to become part of the background. Her body had entered the specific operational mode that her grandmother had described once as the body's way of deciding what actually matters, the shedding of everything peripheral, the narrowing to essentials, the quiet and terrifying clarity that arrives when the stakes become real enough to burn away distraction. She worked, she read, she translated, she cross-referenced. And she thought about the 48-hour window with the concentration of someone who understands that windows once closed do not reopen. The attorney Damien brought in was a woman named Claire Sato, mid-40s, corporate law background. No connection to anyone in Damien's existing network, recommended by a contact in New York, who owed Damien a significant favor, and who had not been told the reason for the recommendation. Claire arrived on Monday morning at the apartment, sat across the table from Sophia, read the documents Sophia had prepared, and did not speak for 11 minutes. Then she looked up and said, "This is extraordinarily sophisticated." "Yes," Sophia said. "Whoever designed this mechanism understood both the legal filing architecture and the underlying documentation structure. This wasn't built by someone who learned one side of it. This was built by someone who operated in both spaces simultaneously." "We know who built it," Sophia said. "What I need from you is whether we can interrupt it without triggering the contingency." Claire looked at the documents again. "There's a contingency." "There's always a contingency," Sophia said. "Mechanisms this sophisticated don't exist without a fallback. If the primary redirect fails, if Holt files incorrectly or doesn't file at all, there will be a secondary path. We need to know what it is before we block the primary, because if we block the primary without controlling the secondary, the mechanism still completes. It just takes a different route." Claire was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of someone reorganizing their understanding of a situation. "You're not just trying to stop this filing. I'm trying to make sure that when the window closes, it closes on them and not on us." The attorney looked at her with a directness that Sophia recognized as professional respect. "Walk me through the Russian language components, the ones that map to the filing requirements." Sophia walked her through it. All of it. The language beneath the language translated now not just from Russian to English, but from the coded register to the structural legal requirements that the coding was designed to conceal. It took an hour and 20 minutes, and by the end of it, Claire had filled 12 pages of legal pad, and her expression had the particular controlled gravity of someone holding something very heavy, very carefully. "The contingency," Claire said, If I'm reading this correctly, if the primary redirect fails, the documentation doesn't disappear. It moves to a holding position. And from a holding position, it can be activated at a later date by a different actor. Which means even if we stop Holt from filing in the next 4 days, the documentation stays loaded, Claire finished, ready to be deployed by whoever holds the activation key. Who holds the activation key? Sophia said, is the fourth man, the one we haven't identified. Claire set down her pen. That's the center of it. That's always been the center of it, Sophia said. We've been working the edges. The fourth man is the mechanism's survival guarantee. As long as he's unidentified and in control of the contingency, blocking Holt is only a partial solution. She called Damien. He picked up on the first ring. The contingency, she said. We need to talk about the contingency. I'm on my way, he said. He arrived in 18 minutes, which told her something about where he had been and how he had been moving through the city for the last several days. He came in with Petrov, and he looked at Claire, and Claire looked at him, and there was a 3-second moment of mutual professional assessment that resolved itself without words. Show me, he said. Sophia showed him. Claire walked him through the legal architecture. Sophia walked him through the language layer underneath it. By the time they finished, Damien was standing at the window, not looking out of it. Facing at his back to the room, doing something internal that required him not to be observed directly. He turned around after 40 seconds. The fourth man, he said. Petrov, where are we? Petrov, who had been listening with the contained attention of a man who processes everything and reveals very little, opened the folder he had been holding since he arrived. 3 remaining candidates, he said. I've eliminated 7. These 3 cannot be eliminated through standard investigation, which itself is significant. All 3 have enough institutional presence to explain a clean record, and all 3 have a documented connection to Morozov's public business network that is legitimate on the surface. He laid 3 photographs on the table. Damien looked at them. His expression did not change. Sophia looked at them. She looked at each face carefully, with the specific attention her grandmother had taught her to bring to visual identification, not looking for what you expected to see, but looking for what was actually there. She stopped at the 3rd photograph. Something moved in her memory. Not a clear image, a fragment. The specific physical quality of a person she had observed from a distance on a Friday night 3 weeks ago. The man who had arrived last, who had taken the seat nearest the door, who had carried himself with a stillness that she had registered as trained, rather than natural. This man, she said. She touched the edge of the photograph without picking it up. His name. Petrov told her. The name did not mean anything to her. She said so. He's a senior legal counsel, Petrov said. Attached to a federal regulatory body. 12-year tenure. Completely clean record. His connection to Morozov is documented as a professional relationship through a trade association, not unusual for someone in his position. He arrived last on Friday, Sophia said. He sat nearest the door. When the conversation shifted to Russian, was it before or after he was fully settled at the table? Petrov looked at her steadily. Why does that matter? Because if it shifted to Russian before he was fully settled, it means the others were comfortable with the language before he arrived, which means they were not switching registers for his benefit. Which means he understands the coded register natively, not because they accommodated him. A beat of silence. After, Petrov said. According to the staff observation timeline I compiled, the private room settled completely approximately 6 minutes before the language shift. Then he was already present when they switched, Sophia said. He chose the Russian environment. He didn't inherit it. Damien looked at Petrov. The regulatory body he's attached to, does it have oversight authority over property transfer filings of the type we're discussing? Petrov's expression shifted by a fraction. Yes. Then the contingency activation isn't passive, Damien said. It's not a documentation transfer that happens independently. It requires an institutional action, a regulatory review, a filing challenge, something that his position gives him the authority to initiate. And if he initiates it, Sophia said, it looks legitimate. It looks like a standard regulatory action. The documentation enters the official record through a process that appears completely independent of Morozov or Holt. That's why they need institutional cover, Claire said, speaking for the first time in several minutes. The mechanism isn't designed to circumvent the system. It's designed to use the system. The regulatory process itself becomes the delivery vehicle. The room held that for a moment. Then Sophia said the thing that no one else had said yet. If he uses his position to initiate a regulatory action, we can't block it the same way we can block Holt's filing. A regulatory action initiated by a legitimate official creates a record that exists independently of anything Morozov or Holt do. Even if we stop them completely if he moves first. We need him to not move, Damien said. He said it with the flat certainty of someone who has just identified the only necessary outcome in a field of insufficient options. Before the window opens, before Holt's filing date, we need him committed to inaction. How? Petrov said. Not a question exactly, more the opening of a problem. Damien looked at Sophia. She looked back at him. She already knew the answer. She had known it since she saw the photograph and felt the fragment of Friday night memory settle into place. She had known it the way she knew all the important things in this situation, not through deduction exactly, but through the specific interpretive sense that her grandmother had spent 15 years building in her the ability to understand what was actually being said, when what was being said was only the surface of the thing. He doesn't know how much we have, she said. Morozov knows I overheard a conversation. He doesn't know what I understood. He doesn't know about the document analysis. He doesn't know about Claire. He doesn't know that we've identified the contingency architecture. She paused. Which means the fourth man he doesn't know either. He thinks his position is still protected. He thinks he's still the invisible center. You want to show him he's not invisible, Damien said. I want to show him what happens if he moves, she said. Not threaten him directly. Not approach him directly. Give him a reason to believe that the cost of activating the contingency is higher than the cost of walking away from it. What reason? She thought about her grandmother's notebooks, about Irina's 11 years in rooms without windows, about the specific nature of the documentation those years had accumulated, not in official records, not in traceable files, but in the precise and comprehensive memory of a woman who had understood that the most powerful archive was the one no one knew existed. I have something, she said. From my grandmother. Damien looked at her with an expression that was very still and very focused, and contained underneath the stillness and the focus something that was neither professional nor operational. Tell me, he said. She told him about the notebooks. Not the one she had shown him, the one she used for field notes. The other ones. The ones filled with Irina's handwriting in 3 languages. The ones that constituted across their full extent a detailed interpretive record of the conversations Irina had been present for over 11 years. Not verbatim transcripts, those would have been too dangerous to keep. But something, in some ways, more valuable, the meaning beneath the words. The interpretive layer. The what was actually being said, rendered in the precise and careful language of a woman who understood that meaning was more durable than quotation. She documented it, Damien said. It was not a question. She documented what it meant, Sophia said, which is different from documenting what was said, and in some ways more useful, because meaning properly recorded cannot be dismissed as a translation error or a mishearing. It is the thing itself. And these notebooks connect, Petrov said, speaking with care, to the network we're describing. I don't know the full extent of what she documented, Sophia said honestly. I've read them many times over many years, but I've read them as a granddaughter, not as an analyst. Over the last few days, I've been reading them differently. She paused. There are entries that reference organizational structures and communication methods that match what I've been analyzing in the documents you gave me. The architecture is the same, which means the network we're looking at has a documented history in my grandmother's handwriting that predates its current form by decades. Damien was very quiet. The fourth man, she said. His institutional position is his protection. But if a record exists that connects his current action to an organizational history that his institution would need to investigate. A history that implicates the network he is serving. Not just the current operation, then moving forward, is not a calculated risk for him. It is an existential one. "You're describing leverage," Claire said. "I'm describing reality," Sophia said. "The leverage is only the fact that the reality is documented." Damien looked at her with an expression that had moved entirely past the professional into something else. Something that was not appropriate to this room, not appropriate to this conversation, not appropriate to the specific urgent problem they were working inside, but that was completely real and completely present in the way his eyes held hers for the 2 seconds before he looked away. "How do we deliver the message," he said, "without exposing you as the source?" "We don't deliver it directly," she said. "We deliver it through Morozov." Everyone in the room looked at her. "Morozov is the connection point," she said. "He knows the network. He knows the fourth man. He knows the organizational history. If Morozov receives information that suggests the existence of Irina's documentation, not the documentation itself, just the suggestion of its existence and its content, he will make the calculation himself. He will understand what it means for the contingency plan, and he will communicate that calculation to the fourth man faster and more effectively than any direct approach we could make. "You're going to feed Morozov information," Petrov said. "Carefully," she said. "Specifically. A single piece of information delivered in the right context, in the right language, in the register, that he will recognize as authentic." She paused. "He needs to believe he has discovered it, not been given it." Damien studied her. "And if he doesn't communicate it to the fourth man, if he decides the information changes his own calculus in a way we haven't anticipated, then we learn something important about where Morozov's real loyalties are," she said. "And we use that too." The room was very quiet for a long moment. Then Petrov said, "The mechanism for delivering the information to Morozov. There's a conversation he will have," Sophia said, "with someone he trusts. Someone inside this building who he believes is unaware of his role in what's being planned." She paused. "I need to know who on the staff he speaks to informally. Not a formal contact. Someone casual. Someone he would drop his register with." Petrov looked at Damien. Damien said Marco. Sophia looked at him. "The sommelier. They have a relationship going back 4 years. Morozov considers Marco a social connection. They've had drinks together outside the restaurant on at least 3 occasions." He paused. "Marco is loyal to this organization. I'm certain of that." "I'm not asking Marco to do anything complex," Sophia said. "I'm asking him to have a natural conversation with Morozov in which something appears in passing. Something Morozov will recognize and Marco will appear entirely unaware of." "What appears in passing?" Petrov said. Sophia reached into the notebook in front of her. She had been preparing this since approximately 2 in the morning when the shape of it had become clear enough to write down. She read them the phrase, 7 words. In Russian, in the specific coded register, carrying the specific embedded meaning that Morozov would understand immediately and that Marco would repeat without comprehension. The phrase properly interpreted communicated the following. "The record exists. The record is comprehensive, and the record is no longer held by a single person." When Morozov heard those 7 words from a man who had no idea what they meant, he would understand 2 things simultaneously: that someone in this city understood the language well enough to have read Irina's documentation, and that whatever protection the fourth man believed his position offered him had been fundamentally compromised. Petrov read the phrase twice. He looked at Damien. Damien looked at Sophia. "You wrote this," he said. "My grandmother taught me," she said. "She said that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is the thing that demonstrates you know the language at all, because the act of speaking it correctly is itself the message." He was quiet for a moment that held more than the room could fully contain. "All right," he said. "We move tonight." Marco Esposito was 61 years old and had worked at Volkov's for 6 years. and had the particular warmth of a man who genuinely liked people and was genuinely good at his work, and had absolutely no idea that the regular guest he poured wine for every 4 to 6 weeks was anything other than a well-connected businessman with good taste in Burgundy. Damien spoke to him privately that afternoon. Not about Morozov, about a wine recommendation for a specific Russian guest who was coming that evening. A recommendation that required Marco to engage Morozov if he arrived in a brief conversation about a particular regional selection. And if the conversation went naturally, to mention casually as something he had overheard without context, a phrase from a conversation that afternoon between 2 staff members who had been speaking quietly near the cellar. He gave Marco the phrase phonetically. Marco's Russian was approximately non-existent, which was precisely the point. He would repeat the sounds without understanding them with the authentic blankness of someone reporting something they had overheard but not understood. Marco, to his credit, asked no questions beyond the practical. He repeated the phrase back 3 times until Damien confirmed the phonetics were right, and then he nodded and said, "I'll make sure he gets the Gevre Chambertin," and went back to his work. Petrov confirmed Morozov's reservation at 6:47. A regular table, solo. Sofia was not in the building. Damien had been explicit about that, and she had agreed without argument because she understood that her presence in the building, while this was in motion, was a risk that served no tactical purpose. She was in the apartment. She had her phone. She had her grandmother's notebooks open on the table in front of her. She waited. At 8:14, Petrov texted Damien. Damien forwarded the text to Sofia. Contact made. Subject's response was immediate and significant. He left the table within 4 minutes of the conversation. Sofia read the text 3 times. Then she texted back, "Where did he go?" Damien unknown. Petrov tracking. 15 minutes passed. She counted them in the specific way she counted things when the counting was the only productive thing available. Then he made a call. Duration 11 minutes. Encrypted line. "We have the number. Claire is working on it." Sofia sat very still. Then Damien called her directly. "It worked," he said. His voice carried something she had not heard in it before. Not relief exactly, but the specific quality of a man who has been carrying an enormous weight for long enough that the first moment of the weight shifting even slightly feels almost physical. "He called the 4th man," she said, almost certainly. Petrov's analysis of the call duration and the timing is consistent with someone who has received unexpected information and is immediately escalating to their primary contact. A pause. "We won't know the content of the call, but we know it happened, and we know it happened within 4 minutes of Marco's conversation." Sofia breathed out slowly. "It's not done." "No," he said. "It's not done. But the 4th man now knows the contingency is compromised, which means either he pulls back or he accelerates," she said. "A beat." "Yes," Damien said, "which is why the next 36 hours are the most important." She looked at her grandmother's notebook spread across the table. At Irina's handwriting. At 11 years of careful, precise, unflinching documentation of things that were not supposed to be understood by anyone outside a very specific circle of power. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "The notebooks. I've been reading them for 3 days with a different set of eyes than I've ever brought to them before. There's an entry." She stopped. She started again. "There's an entry from the late 1980s. My grandmother was interpreting a conversation between men she describes very specifically. The organizational structure she describes. The communication architecture. The specific hierarchy." She paused. "One of the men she describes is identified by a physical description, only she never used names. She said names were the last layer of danger. But the description, the physical characteristics, the specific manner of speaking, the regional accent, and the coded register he used." She stopped. Damien said nothing. He was waiting. "The physical description," she said carefully, "matches Alexei Morozov." The silence that followed was long enough to be its own communication. That's impossible, Damien said finally. And then immediately, tell me why it isn't. Because Morozov would have been in his late 20s or early 30s at the time of the conversation my grandmother recorded, she said. Young enough to have been a junior participant in the kind of meeting she was interpreting. Young enough that his presence would have been unremarkable. Another attendant, another face in the room not yet in a position of authority, but present because he was being developed toward one. She paused. He is not a business associate who was drawn into this network 9 years ago. He has been in this network for at least 40 years. He was built by it. He is in the most literal sense a product of the organization that is now using him against you. Damien's breathing on the other end of the phone was steady, controlled. She could hear the control in it. Petrenko, he said quietly. Petrenko may have been the same, she said. Or Petrenko may have been a genuine friend who was used without his knowledge to make the introduction. I can't determine that from the notebooks, but the introduction itself, Morozov's entry into your life through someone you trusted completely, that is textbook for the methodology my grandmother documented. They don't approach you directly. They approach you through the person you would never question. Because the most effective deceptions, Damien said, and his voice was very quiet now, very controlled with something underneath it that she recognized as the specific kind of grief that arrives not from losing someone, but from discovering that who you lost was not who you thought they were, are the ones that borrow a genuine thing to conceal a false one. Yes, she said softly. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. I've been in this city for 20 years, he said finally. I've built everything here. Everything I was supposed to protect, everything I was supposed to grow, and inside it for 40 years before I was ever part of it, they were already here. Yes, she said. And you walked in from outside, he said. A woman who had spent 6 years being invisible, and you heard 7 words in a corridor. I heard the right 7 words, she said. That's what she built me to do. Another long pause. Sophia. He said her name with a weight that was different from every previous time. When this is over, when the window closes and we're on the other side of it, I want to talk to you about something that has nothing to do with Morozov or Holt or any of this. She held her breath for exactly 1 second. All right, she said. All right, he said. She could hear him collecting himself. Back to the operational. Back to the 36 hours. I need you to go through the notebooks again tonight, he said. Everything connected to Morozov's physical description. Everything that contextualizes the organizational structure from that period. Petrov is going to need the full picture before tomorrow morning. I know, she said. I'm already pulling it. And Sophia. He stopped. I know, she said again. Because she did. She knew what he wasn't saying, and why he wasn't saying it, and what it meant that he wasn't saying it, and she was keeping that knowledge in the same internal space where she kept the things that were real and important and not yet ready to be spoken. Be careful, he said. You too, she said. She put the phone down and pulled the oldest of her grandmother's notebooks toward her and opened it to the entry she had marked with a folded corner of paper. And she began to read again with all the careful, concentrated attention that Irina had spent 15 years building in the granddaughter she had always known would need it. Outside the city, moved through its ordinary evening completely unaware that in a quiet apartment and a closed restaurant, and somewhere in the unlocated space where a man named Alexei Morozov was making decisions about what to do next, a 36-hour clock was running, and somewhere in that same city, a fourth man who had believed himself entirely invisible was sitting with an encrypted phone and a conversation he had not expected to have doing the specific mathematics of someone who has just discovered that the ground beneath their feet is not as solid as they built their life on believing. The window was opening, and Sophia Bennett, her grandmother's granddaughter, was standing exactly at the threshold of it. The 36 hours did not pass quietly. Sophia was still reading at 2 a.m. when her phone lit up with Petrov's name, which meant Damien had authorized the contact directly, which meant something had moved. She answered before the second ring. Morozov is not at his registered address. Petrov said. No preamble. He never used preamble. He checked out of his hotel at 11:40. He is not at either of his two known alternative locations in the city. His car is still in the hotel garage. Sophia processed that in the 3 seconds before she spoke. He's not running. Why do you say that? Because someone who is running takes their car. Someone who leaves their car is meeting someone who is coming to them, someone who doesn't want the meeting on record. She stood up from the table. He's still in the city. He received the message through Marco, and he called the fourth man, and now they are in the same physical location deciding what to do about us. A pause on Petrov's end that told her he had already considered this and was confirming rather than receiving. Agreed. The question is what they decide. What are the options? 3, Petrov said. They accelerate the timeline and attempt to file before we can block it, which requires Holt to move tonight. They abandon the mechanism entirely and cut their losses, which requires them to accept that the window closes without the outcome they've built 8 years toward. Or, he stopped. Or they come at us directly, Sophia said. Yes. She looked at the notebooks on the table, at Irina's handwriting, at the physical evidence of 40 years of organizational history that was currently sitting in an apartment that only 4 people knew the address of. Where is Damien? She said. With me, Petrov said. And then Damien's voice came on the line, which meant he had been there the whole time listening. I'm here, he said. You heard all of it. A pause. I need you to do something, and I need you to tell me honestly if you're not able to do it. Tell me what it is first. The notebooks. I need them out of that apartment. Not digitized, not copied, physically moved tonight to a location that only you know. Not me, not Petrov, only you. She understood immediately. Because if they come at us directly, and they reach the apartment, the notebooks are the only thing in this entire situation that cannot be reconstructed, he said. Everything else, the document analysis, the filing architecture, Claire's legal work, we have copies, we have records, we have multiple instances. The notebooks are singular. They are irreplaceable. And right now, they are the most dangerous thing in this city. Dangerous to them, she said, which makes them dangerous to you, he said. By extension, by direct implication. He paused. Move them. Now. Tonight. And then tell no one where they are, including me. She thought about what he was actually saying. He was telling her to hold the most important piece of this independently. He was telling her that his own inability to find the notebooks was a feature, not a failure, that the protection for the notebooks was precisely that the person who controlled them was not connected to him in any way that could be compelled. He was trusting her with the only truly irreplaceable thing in the situation. She thought about what that meant from a man who had spent 20 years trusting almost no one. All right, she said. Go now, he said. Don't call until you're clear. She was already moving. She packed the notebooks into the bag she had carried from her original apartment, worn canvas. Nothing remarkable. The kind of bag that disappeared in a crowd. She put on her coat. She did not turn off any of the lights because dark apartments draw attention in a way that lit ones don't. She went out the back of the building through the service exit that she had identified on her first day there, because her grandmother had taught her that knowing exit routes was not paranoia, but basic spatial intelligence. She walked. She did not take a cab because cabs had records. She did not take the subway because the subway had cameras at every entrance. She walked for 22 minutes through the November cold, with the bag over her shoulder and her mind running clean and fast, the way it ran when the situation demanded everything peripheral be stripped away. She went to the one place in this city that belonged to her entirely. Not the apartment Damien controlled. Not the restaurant where she worked. Not any location connected to the last 3 weeks. She went to the public library branch 3 neighborhoods away that she had been visiting every Thursday morning for 2 years, because they had a reading room in the back with wooden chairs and tall windows, and the specific quality of silence that existed only in places where people had been choosing quiet for a very long time. The library was closed at this hour, But she had a key to the reading room. This required some explanation. The librarian who managed the branch was a 73-year-old woman named Ruth Hoang, who had emigrated from Vietnam in 1979, and who had in her first year in America been helped by a program that provided translation services for new immigrants. The woman who had provided her translation services that year had been named Irina Bennett. Ruth Hoang had never forgotten that. She had told Sophia this on their third Thursday together over the specific and complete coincidence of Sophia giving her name, and Ruth stopping with the expression of someone encountering something that logic should not have made possible. She had given Sophia the key 6 months later quietly, with the explanation that the reading room was available to people who needed it, and that Sophia struck her as someone who would sometimes need it. Sophia had never used the key at night. She used it now. She sat in the reading room with the notebooks in the bag beside her chair, and she breathed in the specific silence of the place. And she let herself be for exactly 4 minutes. Not an operative or a translator, or a woman in the middle of something dangerous, but just herself. Irina Bennett's granddaughter in a quiet room carrying something that mattered. Then she took out her phone and texted Damien Clear. His response, "Good. Stay there. Update in 1 hour." She sat with the notebooks and waited. What happened in the next 4 hours, she learned in pieces. The first piece came at 3:15. Petrov had identified Morozov's location not through surveillance, but through a contact in a hotel security network. A man who owed a debt of the particular kind that gets paid in information rather than money. Morozov was at a private residence in Back Bay. The residence was registered to a corporate entity. The corporate entity, when traced through 3 layers of structure, connected to a name that Petrov recognized from the document analysis. The 4th man was there. They were together, which confirmed the meeting Sophia had predicted, but also confirmed something more specific: they had not separated after the call. They were making decisions in the same physical location, which meant the decisions were significant enough that a phone call was insufficient. They needed to be in the same room. That told Sophia something. "They're not cutting their losses," she texted Damien. His response came in 40 seconds. "We know. Holt has been contacted. Petrov intercepted a message. They're moving the timeline up. Holt is being asked to file tonight." She stared at that for a moment. Tonight meant the 48-hour window she had identified had been abandoned as a parameter. They were no longer waiting for the optimal filing moment. They were filing now under pressure, which meant the filing would be less clean, less perfectly structured, which meant Claire might find the gaps more easily, but which also meant there was very little time. She called Damien directly. "Claire," she said the moment he answered. "Already called. She's working." The specific component the redirect mechanism Holt has to include a particular filing addendum. Without it, the redirect doesn't function. Claire knows what it looks like. "She's monitoring the filing system in real time," Damien said. "The moment Holt submits, she'll see it. And she can challenge it. She can flag it for review, which suspends the filing for 72 hours, during which it cannot be finalized." He paused. "But the flag has to come from a legitimate legal standing. She needs a basis." "She has one," Sophia said. "The organizational history in the notebooks establishes a documented pattern of the same mechanism being used in previous decades. That pattern constitutes evidence of fraudulent intent that predates this specific filing. A challenge based on documented historical precedent of the same mechanism is legitimate. Can you provide documentation tonight? I can provide the specific entries, dated in Irina's handwriting with the interpretive layer that connects them to the current mechanism." She was already opening the bag. "Give me 40 minutes. "You have 30, he said. She had 30. She worked with a speed that was not frantic. Frantic was her grandmother's word for the kind of work that looked productive and produced nothing. She worked with the clean, concentrated efficiency of someone who knows exactly where the relevant material is, because they have been reading it for 3 days with the specific question of what it would need to say in this moment. She photographed 9 pages. She sent them to Claire through the secure system Petrov had established. She sent a separate document typed precisely organized 11 paragraphs that translated the specific language of each entry into the interpretive English that Claire could use as the explanatory layer for a legal challenge. She sent the last paragraph at 3:54. Claire responded at 4:01. This is sufficient. Filing challenge submitted. System shows. Holt's submission came in at 3:47. Our challenge arrived in time. Filing is suspended. Sophia read that 3 times. Then she sat back in the wooden chair in the silent reading room and put her hands flat on the table and breathed. She texted Damien the single word, "Done." His response took 90 seconds, long enough that she was aware of the 90 seconds passing. Then, come back. Odyssey. She arrived at the location Petrov directed her to. Not the restaurant, not the apartment, but a third location she hadn't been to, before a building that Damien's organization used for meetings that required more security than the restaurant provided. Petrov met her at the entrance. He looked at her with an expression that was as close to warmth as Petrov's expression ever reached, which was not very close at all, but was recognizable if you knew what to look for. "Good work tonight," he said. Coming from Petrov, those 3 words were the equivalent of a standing ovation. She followed him inside. Damien was on a call when she entered the room. He saw her immediately. His eyes went to her the moment she walked in before he had finished the sentence he was speaking. And the specific quality of the look he gave her was something she filed away in the part of her that was not operational, in the part that was allowed to notice things that weren't relevant to the problem. He finished the call in under 2 minutes. He set the phone down. He looked at her across the room with an expression that had none of the controlled professional distance of the last 3 weeks. "The filing is suspended," he said. "I know," Claire confirmed. "Holt has been contacted by my legal team. Not by me, by Claire acting in her official capacity as counsel of record. He has been informed of the challenge and of the specific basis for it." He paused. "He knows that the historical precedent we cited could only have come from someone with access to documentation that should not exist." "He's panicking," Sophia said. "He called Morozov 12 minutes ago. The call lasted 4 minutes. He paused again. 4 minutes is not a call between people who are holding their position. 4 minutes is a call between people who are deciding how to exit. "They're going to run," she said. "Morozov, possibly. Holt." He shook his head. "Holt is a lawyer. He understands that running creates a different kind of problem than staying and fighting. He's going to do something more calculated than running." "What?" "He's going to try to negotiate," Damien said. "He's going to contact someone, probably not me, probably a regulatory body or a law enforcement contact, and he's going to offer what he knows about the network in exchange for the kind of protection that the 4th man can no longer provide." Sophia absorbed that. "He's going to burn the network to save himself." "Yes. Which means the 4th man will understand what Holt is doing and will need to make a similar calculation even faster." Damien's voice was steady and quiet, and carried underneath it the specific weight of someone who had been awake for a very long time, holding a very heavy thing. "The network that has spent 40 years building a mechanism to use against my organization is about to be dismantled from the inside by the people who built it, because the alternative prosecution with documented historical evidence is more dangerous to them than everything else." Sophia said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about the way it had resolved itself. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a direct assault, but with the quiet collapse of a thing that had been undermined at its foundation by the simple patient act of understanding what was being said when everyone believed no one was listening. Her grandmother would have recognized it. "There's something you need to know," Damien said. He moved toward her not quickly, but with the specific deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is implementing it. He stopped at a distance that was closer than professional, but not yet anything else. And he looked at her with the full, unmanaged attention that she had learned over 3 weeks, was the most honest version of his face. "The 4th man," he said. "We have confirmation." Petrov found him. Petrov found him 2 hours ago, after the filing challenge created a paper trail that his position could no longer fully obscure. He paused. His name is Richard Calloway. He is a senior regulatory counsel who has been in his position for 12 years. He has, during those 12 years, used his institutional authority to provide protective cover for at least 4 operations connected to the network your grandmother documented. 12 years, she said. He was placed there, Damien said. Not hired placed. His entire career trajectory was engineered by the network to position someone with regulatory authority at exactly the right level of institutional power. He stopped. The level of planning this represents, the timeline of it. They began building toward this specific moment more than a decade before the moment arrived. Sophia thought about Irina's notebooks, about the entries from 40 years ago, about the organizational architecture her grandmother had described, the patience of it, the generational scope of it, the way it built toward outcomes that no single individual would live to see completed. They play long games, she said. They have been playing this one since before I built anything in this city, he said. Since before I was old enough to have anything worth taking. He paused. Which means whatever I did to attract this, whatever made me a target, it wasn't something I chose. It was something I was selected for, long before I was aware of being selected. She looked at him, at the man who had spent 20 years believing that the risks he navigated were the result of the world he had chosen, and who was now understanding that some of the most significant risks of his life had been placed around him by people who had identified him as useful before he had identified himself as anything at all. That's not your fault, she said. He looked at her with an expression that said he was working toward believing that and was not entirely there yet. No, he said, but it is my problem. It was your problem, she said. The filing is suspended. Calloway is exposed. Holt is negotiating his exit from the network, which means he is actively providing information that will accelerate the exposure of everyone connected to it. Morozov. She paused. Morozov, Damien said, and something moved in his voice at that name, something old and tired and genuinely grieving, because however clear the betrayal was, 9 years was 9 years, and the human cost of that was real, regardless of the professional clarity of it. Morozov is the part I haven't resolved. Where is he? Still in the city. Petrov has eyes on the Back Bay address. He hasn't moved since Holt's call. A pause. He knows it's over. The question is what he does with that knowledge. He could still move against you directly, she said. If he believes there's nothing left to lose, he won't, Damien said. And the certainty in his voice was not the certainty of wishful thinking. It was the certainty of someone who had spent 9 years watching a person and who, now that the performance was stripped away, was seeing the real person underneath and making a real assessment. Morozov is not impulsive. He has never been impulsive. Whatever he is calculated. And the calculation he is making right now is the same one Holt is making: which path leads to the least destruction. They're going to cooperate, she said. Eventually, he said. With whomever makes the most compelling case for why cooperation is the better option. He looked at her. Which is why in approximately 3 hours, I am going to make a phone call to a specific federal contact who has been trying to build a case against this network for 7 years, and who has been unable to do so because every potential witness either disappeared or recanted. He paused. I am going to offer him something he has never had. A documented historical record in the handwriting of a credentialed interpreter who was present at the original organizational meetings. A record that establishes continuity, methodology, and identity across 4 decades. Sophia was very still. You're talking about Irina's notebooks. I'm asking about them, he said. I'm not taking them. I'm not directing you. I'm asking whether you believe, given everything you know about what your grandmother built and why she built it, that this is what she documented those things for. The room was completely quiet. She thought about her grandmother, about Irina at 72 in a hospital in Cambridge holding a rosary, and her granddaughter's hand, knowing that she was leaving behind the only person she had ever trusted with the full weight of what she carried. About the 15 years of lessons. About the language beneath the language. About the notebooks filled with precise, careful, deliberately preserved knowledge of things that were not supposed to be understood. She thought about what Irina had said in the last year of her life, when Sophia had asked her why she kept the notebooks when keeping them was dangerous. Irina had said, "Because the truth does not stop being true when inconvenient people decide to ignore it, and someone has to be the keeper of it until the moment arrives when it can be used." "Yes," Sophia said, "that's what she built them for." "What?" Damien nodded once. The nod of a man who has received the answer he needed and knows what to do with it. "Then we go forward," he said. "We go forward," she agreed. And then, because they were both still standing at close distance, because the last 3 weeks had been the most consequential 3 weeks of both their lives, because they had run out of operational things to say and were standing in the silence that exists when the crisis has resolved, and the only thing left is the people who resolved it. Damien said, "I told you I wanted to talk to you about something, when this was over." "I remember," she said. "It's over," he said. She looked at him. "Is it?" "The acute part," he said. "The part where every conversation was also a tactical decision. The part where everything personal had to be set aside because there wasn't room for it." He paused. "That part is over. And now there's room," she said. "I want there to be room," he said. "That's what I wanted to tell you, that I want there to be room for whatever this is. Whatever it has been becoming for 3 weeks while we were both pretending it wasn't becoming anything." She thought about all the moments she had been filing in the part of herself that wasn't operational. The way he said her name. The 90-second pause before he texted, "Come back." The way his eyes had gone to her the moment she walked into the room tonight. "I'm not pretending," she said. Something in his face settled. Something that had been held with effort released not dramatically, just quietly, the way a long-carried thing releases when you finally set it down somewhere safe. "Good," he said. "But I need you to understand something," she said. "Tell me." "I am not a person who can be managed," she said. "I'm not saying that as a warning or as a condition. I'm saying it because it's the truest thing I know about myself, and if this is going to be anything you need to know it at the beginning while it's still useful information." She paused. "I spent 6 years being invisible because I chose to be. I can choose otherwise. But I don't become visible on someone else's terms. I'm visible on my own." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "I knew it the night you walked into my office. You were the first person in a very long time who talked to me like someone who had nothing to lose by being honest." "I had everything to lose," she said. "I chose honesty anyway." "That's exactly what I mean," he said. She held his gaze. He held hers. "Partnership," she said. "That's the word for what I'm willing to consider. Not protection. Not arrangement. Partnership." "Yes," he said. Without hesitation. Without qualification. She nodded once. What came after was not simple. She had never expected it to be simple, and she was not disappointed when it wasn't. Richard Calloway resigned his position 8 days later, citing personal reasons. The resignation was followed within 48 hours by a federal investigation that had been opened on the basis of materials provided by a source that the official record described only as a documentary archive of historical significance. Lawrence Holt's cooperation agreement was finalized within 2 weeks. His testimony, combined with the documentary record, provided the investigative team with enough material to pursue the network across multiple jurisdictions. Alexei Morozov did not run. He called Damien. The call lasted 27 minutes. Sophia was not present for it. Damien told her afterward in the specific and honest way he had committed to what was said. Morozov had told him that everything he had done had been structured before he met Damien. That the 9 years of association had been assignment, not friendship. That the network's interest in Damien's organization predated Morozov's introduction to it and would have found a different mechanism if Morozov had not been the one chosen. He had also said at the end of the call that the one thing he had not anticipated was Damien. Not as a target. As a person. He said, "I expected a man who would be easy to take from because he had built on sand. You built on something I didn't expect." Damien had asked, "What?" Morozov had said loyalty, Actual loyalty, not performed loyalty. I have spent 40 years inside an organization that manufactures the performance of loyalty. I forgot what the real version looked like. By the time I remembered, it was too late to do anything about it. Damien had not responded to that. He told Sophia he didn't know what the right response was. She told him that sometimes there wasn't one. That sometimes the only thing to do with a truth like that was to hold it. Morozov cooperated with the federal investigation. His testimony was extensive. The network, which had operated in various forms for over 4 decades, did not collapse immediately. Organizations built to survive generational timescales don't collapse quickly. But its operational capacity in the United States was significantly degraded. Its institutional cover was removed, and the documentary foundation that Irina Bennett had been quietly preserving across decades was now part of an official record that no one could make disappear. Sophia read the confirmation of that in a brief formal notification from Claire, who had been brought on as consulting counsel for the archival submission. She read it sitting at the desk in an office she now occupied 3 days a week at a consulting firm that had been formally established under her name, specializing in linguistic interpretation and cross-cultural conflict analysis for international business disputes. The firm's first major client had been introduced by Damien. The second and third she had found independently. By the 4th month, she had more work than she could manage alone, and had begun the process of hiring, which was something she had never imagined doing, and which turned out to require a very specific combination of judgment and trust that she was, it turned out, reasonably good at. Damien was present in her life in the way that people are present when they have decided to be present, and have the patience to let the form of that presence develop at the pace it actually develops, rather than the pace impatience would prefer. He came to the office sometimes not to check on her, but because they had developed the specific domestic rhythm of two people who are better at thinking when the other person is in the room. They had dinner. They argued about things that were not crises. They were figuring out what they were, which was slower and more honest and more worthwhile than either of them had managed before with anyone else. She did not move into his world. She did not become a person whose significance derived from proximity to his. She built her own significance in her own office with her own clients in the language her grandmother had spent 15 years teaching her, because she had always known it would matter. It mattered. Petrov retired the following spring, which surprised everyone who worked with him, and surprised no one who knew him. He gave Sophia a small wrapped package on his last day at the organization. Inside was a copy of a photograph, black and white, slightly blurred, taken in a building she didn't recognize. 3 people standing at a table covered in papers. One of them was a young woman she didn't immediately recognize. She looked more closely. The young woman's posture, the way she held her hands, the specific angle of her attention. Sophia's throat tightened. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in Petrov's careful handwriting, Irina Vasilova, Moscow, 1974. She had never seen a photograph of her grandmother young. She had only known Irina as an old woman, small and precise, and full of a particular kind of knowing that settled over everything she touched. This young woman in the photograph was 26, maybe 27. She was standing in a room with dangerous men, and she was looking at something off camera, with an expression that was neither afraid nor pretending not to be afraid. She was looking at something with the specific, complete attention of someone who has decided to see clearly, regardless of what the seeing costs. Sophia held the photograph for a long time. Then she framed it and put it on the desk in her office next to the notebooks. That evening, Damien came to the office after his last meeting. He saw the photograph. He picked it up carefully. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Sophia. "She looks like you," he said. "I look like her," Sophia said. "There's a difference." He considered that. "Tell me the difference." She built the language and carried it alone for 50 years because there was no one she could give it to who was ready to receive it. Sophia looked at the photograph in his hands. "I received it, and I used it, which means she doesn't have to carry it anymore." Damien set the photograph down gently. He looked at Sophia the way he had been looking at her since the beginning, with the full, unhurried attention of someone who is genuinely seeing what is actually there. She would be proud of you, he said. I know, Sophia said, and she meant it without qualification, without the deflection that humility sometimes borrows to avoid being moved. She was moved. She let herself be moved. I know she would. He reached across the desk and took her hand. Not dramatically, just the steady present warmth of a man who had learned at considerable cost that the most powerful thing he could offer another person was not protection or power or any of the things his world had told him were the only things worth giving. It was simply this, to be the person who stayed, who did not manage or maneuver or calculate, who was in the most fundamental sense there. She held his hand back. Outside Boston moved through the ordinary business of its evening, completely indifferent to the small office where a woman who had spent 6 years perfecting invisibility was sitting in the full light of her own life, holding the hand of a man who had spent 20 years building walls and had finally, at considerable cost and with considerable help, figured out that walls were not the same as foundations. Irina Bennett had spent 50 years carrying a truth that the world was not ready for. She had carried it carefully, precisely, and without complaint, because she understood that the value of a thing is not diminished by the fact that no one can yet see it. She had given that truth to the one person she trusted to know when the world was finally ready. Sophia had known, and she had spoken. That was not nothing. That was not a small private story about a woman who got lucky in a corridor. That was the moment when 50 years of patient, careful, deliberate preservation met the exact circumstances it had been preserved for. The gift had been waiting for the right moment. The moment had come, and Sophia Bennett, her grandmother's granddaughter, had answered it with everything she had not, because she was fearless, not because she was powerful, not because she had been chosen by the right person or protected by the right man, but because she had been built carefully and with love, to see what others could not see, to hear what others could not hear, and to speak the truth. At the exact moment when speaking, it could change everything. She had changed everything, and in doing so she had finally completely and without reservation become herself.